The canyon had no name on any map that the Harlan County Land Office kept. It appeared on the survey documents as a notation in parentheses beside a property boundary line: dry gulch, no water, no access, no value. 4 qualifications written by a surveyor who had stood at the rim, looked down at the basalt walls and the dry floor, and moved on without descending. The notation had been accurate as far as it went. It had not gone far enough. The surveyor had not descended because there was no obvious reason to descend, and the surveyor had not had a grandfather who spent 30 years descending into that canyon in every season and every weather condition, and writing down in careful pencil what he found each time he went in. I had that grandfather, and I had the notebooks he left me. When the will was read in the spring of the year I turned 18, the lawyer looked up from the document and looked at me across the table with the expression of a man being kind about something he considers unfortunate. He said my grandfather had left me the canyon. He paused after saying it in the way people pause after delivering news they expect to land badly. Around the table there were 2 cousins, an uncle and a neighbor, who had already received his portion and was staying out of curiosity. None of them said anything immediately, but 2 of them smiled, not unkindly, the smile of people who have just watched someone receive something they believe is worthless and are quietly relieved it wasn't given to them. I looked at the lawyer and said nothing. I signed the papers he placed in front of me. I folded my copy into the inside pocket of my coat. I walked out into the spring light and stood on the main street of Harlan for a moment, looking east at the dark line of the canyon rim against the sky. I had been looking at that line since I was old enough to understand what it was. I knew exactly what was inside it. I also knew that explaining what was inside it to a room full of people who had already decided the answer was a waste of the morning. I went home. I packed what I needed. I started walking. This is the story of what I found inside that canyon, of what my grandfather had been building there for 30 years before he left it to me, and of why, 20 years after the will was read and the cousins smiled, every family in Harlan County was eating something that had come from those 38 acres. The survey document described as no water, no access, no value. If you stay until the end, you will understand what my grandfather understood, and what he spent a lifetime trying to teach me, about the difference between what land looks like from outside and what it holds on the inside. My name is Ren Calloway. I was 18 years old when this story began, which meant I was old enough to sign documents, and young enough that the men of Harlan County did not take seriously anything I said about land or water, or what a canyon could produce if you understood it correctly. I had been saying things about the canyon since I was old enough to repeat what my grandfather told me, and I had been watching people's expressions move from mild interest to polite dismissal for as long as I could remember. My grandfather had not seemed to mind this. He said that land does not care what people think about it. It only responds to what is done to it. He said this often enough and in enough different contexts that by the time I was 12, I had understood it was not casual wisdom, but a working principle. The organizing premise of everything he did in that canyon for 30 years. His name was Eli Calloway. He had come to Harlan County 40 years before I was born, when the county was new enough that the land office was still working from hand-drawn maps, and the survey data was incomplete enough that a careful observer could find things the official records had missed. Eli was a careful observer. He had been a surveyor before he settled in Harlan, which meant he knew what surveyors missed, not from incompetence but from methodology, because survey work moves at a pace that does not allow for the kind of sustained, repeated observation that reveals what land holds in different seasons and different water years and different temperature conditions. A surveyor sees land once, in one season, under one set of conditions, and records what is visible. Eli had seen the canyon once as a surveyor, and dozens of times as something else, as a man who had decided this particular piece of ground was worth knowing completely. He had walked the canyon for the first time in the spring of his second year in Harlan, following a description from an older Navajo man who had traded at the settlement where Eli worked, a description of a canyon to the east, where the ground was different from the surrounding territory, where things grew that shouldn't grow in that climate, where water appeared in places that the surface topography didn't explain. Eli had gone to look. What he found on that first visit was enough to make him come back. What he found on the second visit was enough to make him file a land claim through the county office, quietly, without announcing it, paying the modest fee and letting the paperwork process without drawing attention to it. He had learned early that quiet claims processed more cleanly than publicized ones, and that the most durable way to hold something valuable was to make sure nobody understood its value until you had built something with it that was too established to dislodge. He spent 30 years building that something. Then he left it to me with 6 notebooks, a planting record, and 1 instruction written on the inside cover of the first notebook in his careful surveyor's hand. Learn it the way I learned it, not the way I told you about it. Go in alone. Read it yourself. The notebooks are the map, not the territory. The morning I walked into the canyon for the first time alone, without his hand on my shoulder directing my attention, without his voice telling me what to look for, I stopped at the entrance and stood still for a long time. Not because I was uncertain, because I wanted to do what he had instructed, to read it myself from the beginning, as if for the first time, without the overlay of everything he had already shown me. Looking at what was actually there rather than what I expected to find. What was actually there was this. The canyon walls were basalt, volcanic, dark, dense, with a heat retention capacity significantly higher than the limestone formations that surrounded the county on 3 sides. The walls ran north to south, which meant the canyon floor received direct sunlight for 8 hours in summer and 4 in winter. Less than the open valley, but concentrated, held by the basalt, rather than dissipating into open air. The canyon floor sat 40 feet below the surrounding terrain at its deepest point, which created a microclimate, a pocket of still air that accumulated heat through the day, and was held there by the walls rather than dispersed by the wind that moved across the open country above. The floor was level at its center, and slightly sloped at both ends, which meant drainage ran south without pooling at the low points. The soil at the surface was thin and pale, the kind of surface soil that accumulates in enclosed spaces from wind-carried mineral dust over decades, not deep enough to grow anything without amendment. And there was water, not where the survey document said there wasn't, because the survey document was correct that there was no surface creek, but there was water. My grandfather had shown me where. He had taken me to the north wall of the canyon on our 3rd visit together when I was 9 years old, and he had placed my palm flat against the basalt at a specific point and held my hand there for 30 seconds without speaking. I had felt it, not dramatically, a coolness in the rock that was different from the ambient temperature of the wall surface, a difference you would miss entirely if you were looking at the wall rather than feeling it. Water. Moving through the stone, behind the surface. He had spent 3 years finding where it came out and 2 more years building the first containment around it. I had watched him work on it from the time I was old enough to carry a small stone without dropping it. If you have ever been told that something you were given was worthless, and you knew, even when you couldn't yet prove it, that the person saying it was wrong, subscribe and follow along. This channel is for people who understand that some things take time to prove, and what I built in that canyon proved itself in ways that nobody in Harlan had prepared for. The spring surfaced at the north wall of the canyon in a crack in the basalt at a point 6 feet above the canyon floor. In a naturally recessed section of the wall, an alcove 4 feet deep and 8 feet wide, that my grandfather had gradually extended over the years by removing loose rock from the back wall with a steel pry bar until the space was 12 feet deep, and the spring could be accessed from inside a sheltered area rather than from the exposed canyon floor. The extension had taken 3 seasons. He had recorded each season's progress in the second notebook, with measurements and observations about how the rock responded to the pry bar at different depths, which layers fractured cleanly and which required more force, where the basalt was homogeneous and where it contained veins of softer material that crumbled rather than broke. The notes were the notes of an engineer before engineering was a formal profession in that part of the territory. The spring produced a flow that varied by season but never stopped, a consistent thread of water in the dry months and a stronger flow in spring when snowmelt from the high country was filtering through the volcanic rock above and arriving here, cold and clear, already filtered through 50 feet of dense basalt. My grandfather had measured the flow at 4 points in the seasonal cycle over 10 consecutive years, and had recorded the measurements in a table in the second notebook. The consistency of the numbers across 10 years was remarkable, not because the flow was large, but because the variation was small. A small consistent source was more valuable in a drought than a large inconsistent one, and the canyon was in a county that had droughts. He had built the first containment in the second year of his ownership, a curved wall of fitted basalt blocks across the front of the alcove, rising to 3 feet, creating a basin that the spring could fill before overflowing through a notch he had cut in the top center of the wall. The overflow ran along a channel he had carved into the canyon floor, a groove 6 inches wide and 4 inches deep, cut by hand over 2 seasons with a steel chisel and a mallet, running south along the east canyon wall to a second basin. From the second basin, the overflow continued south to a third. 3 basins, gravity-fed, no pump required, positioned to serve 3 different sections of the canyon floor. The design had taken him 1 winter to plan and 2 years to build, and had not been modified in the 25 years between its completion and his death, because it worked correctly the first time, and he had not needed to modify it. The canyon floor was 42 feet long, and between 12 and 20 feet wide at various points. By the time my grandfather died, he had terraced it, cut into the slope at 4 points to create level planting surfaces held in place by fitted basalt walls 18 inches high, built from the same flat stones that had broken from the canyon walls over centuries and accumulated on the floor in quantities that would never be exhausted. None of the terraces was large. The biggest was 15 feet by 10, but they were deep. He had been building soil in each terrace for 30 years, carrying organic material in from outside the canyon in a canvas sack he wore across his back, and adding it to the canyon's own accumulated leaf fall and decomposed plant matter from previous seasons. The upper terrace held 14 inches of dark-growing medium with a mineral richness from the volcanic parent rock that no purchased amendment could replicate. The lower terrace, which received the most consistent water from the drainage system, held 11 inches of soil with a higher clay content that retained moisture longer, which made it ideal for the root crops that needed consistent moisture through their development. I walked the terraces the first morning and ran my hands through the soil in each one. I assessed it by feel and smell before opening any notebook. I knew what good soil felt like. The cohesive texture that meant organic matter content, the smell that meant active microbial life, the way it held together when compressed and broke apart when released, the dark color that meant depth of fertility. The upper terrace soil was the best I had ever put my hands in, better than the valley floor that everyone in Harlan considered productive farmland. Better by a margin I could feel with my palms and smell in the air when I turned it, and could see in the color that was nearly black rather than the brown of ordinary topsoil. I sat on the edge of the upper terrace and opened the notebook my grandfather had left with the will. Not one of the 6 observation notebooks, but a separate document he had prepared specifically as a handover. The lawyer had given it to me with the comment that it appeared to be personal correspondence. It was not personal correspondence. It was a planting record. 30 years of entries, what he had grown in each terrace, in what season, with what result, yields per square foot in units that allowed direct comparison across years, variety performance by specific cultivar name, water requirements at each growth stage expressed in minutes of basin overflow, soil amendment additions, and their observed effects on the following season's yield. It was the most complete agricultural record I had ever seen for a single piece of ground, and it was mine, and not a single person in Harlan County knew it existed. I planted my first seeds in the upper terrace that afternoon, using the varieties his records identified as highest yielding in volcanic soil. I followed his water schedule exactly, measuring the basin overflow duration with the pocket watch I had brought for this purpose. I did not tell anyone in Harlan what I was doing. I had nothing to announce. I had soil and seeds and water and a notebook. What I did not yet have was proof, and proof in my experience of how Harlan County processed information about the canyon was the only currency that moved people from the smile they had given at the reading of the will to the attention that the canyon had always deserved. The proof would come. I had 30 years of my grandfather's patience as evidence that it would. The first summer was education more than production. I was learning the canyon the way my grandfather had instructed, not from a single visit, but from repeated passes in different conditions, each pass adding something to the understanding that previous passes had not provided. I kept my own notebook parallel to his, recording what I observed and how it compared to what he had written. Where my observations confirmed his, I noted the confirmation and the date. Where they differed, I investigated, as with the lower terrace drainage, which was not behaving as his notes described, and that I traced to a sediment blockage in the drainage channel, cleared in 2 days, restoring the drainage to its designed behavior. I recorded the clearing date, the sediment volume removed, and the observed improvement alongside his original drainage notes. The combined document was becoming something more complete than either of us could have produced alone. His 30 years of observation providing the baseline against which my current observations could be measured, my current observations identifying the places where 30 years of accumulation had changed things in ways that his notes no longer fully described. The harvest that first autumn was partial, late planting, first-year soil disturbance, varieties still establishing root depth. But it was a harvest. More food than I could use alone from ground the county records described as producing nothing. I carried the surplus into Harlan on a Thursday in August and sold it at the market. The man who bought the winter squash asked where it had come from. I told him. He looked at me with the mild recalibration of someone whose existing category for a thing is not adequate for the new information they have just received. He paid me and said nothing further. By the following Thursday, 3 people had asked about the canyon. By the end of August, I had 5 regular buyers. None of them knew about the spring or the terraces or the planting record. They knew the food existed and was better than what was available elsewhere. And that was the information that mattered to them as buyers. I did not offer more than the current situation required. I had learned from my grandfather that the right amount of information to share at any given moment was exactly the amount that served the current transaction and no more. What none of them understood yet, what I would not fully understand myself until my 2nd October, was that the canyon's microclimate extended the growing season 6 weeks beyond the valley's last frost date. 6 weeks in a county where winter came early and stayed long was not a marginal advantage. It was the difference between a canyon that produced food and a canyon that produced food when no one else in the county had any left to sell. I discovered this when I forgot to harvest the last section of the upper terrace before the valley's first frost, and returned 3 days later expecting damage. The plants were untouched, still growing. The frost had ended at the canyon rim. The basalt walls had held the accumulated summer heat in the enclosed space for 3 days, past the date when the open valley had lost its season entirely. I stood in the upper terrace for a long time, feeling the warm enclosed air on my face and looking at green plants growing in ground that the valley below had already surrendered to the cold. Then I opened the notebook and wrote the date, the temperatures, and a single line underlined twice. Frost line ends at canyon rim. Then I went back to town and told no one. I had 2 more weeks of growing season that nobody else had, and I intended to use every day of them before I said anything about it to anyone. The 3rd year was the year the drought forced Harlan County to understand what the canyon was. The drought had been building since July, slow and steady, revealing itself in the creek level falling week by week, and the pasture browning earlier than usual, and the grain stores being recalculated against a winter that was looking longer than comfortable. By August, the east side wells had dropped to half their normal depth. By September, 2 ranches had sold cattle they could not feed through winter. By October, the county water board was issuing conservation guidance that most families followed out of genuine necessity. The valley's last frost came 3 weeks early that year, which meant the growing season was shorter and the food gap going into winter was wider than anyone wanted to calculate directly. The canyon's spring had not varied from its average output through the entire drought. I had been measuring the flow every week since my first spring, and I had the records. The volcanic aquifer above was deep enough that surface drought conditions did not reach the water table it drew from. My grandfather had documented 2 serious droughts in his 30 years, and both times the spring had continued without interruption, while the valley's surface water sources failed. I had read those drought year records in the spring of the 3rd year, and I had planted accordingly. Drought year varieties, more water efficient, deeper rooting, adapted to reduced irrigation schedules. The upper terrace harvest in October of the 3rd year was the largest I had produced. The lower terraces were producing crops the open valley had stopped producing in August, and the extended growing season gave me 2 additional weeks of production after the valley had finished entirely. 2 weeks in which I was the only person in Harlan County selling fresh food from soil that was still actively growing. People came to the market stall every Thursday from September through November. Not the trickle of curious buyers from the first summer, families purchasing against a winter the available county supply was not going to cover. I sold at the prices my grandfather's one-line economics instruction had established in my thinking years before I had a stall to apply it to. Cost of production plus cost of holding, not price of desperation. The prices were fair. The buyers came back every week. By November, I had more regular buyers than surplus to sell, and I managed the allocation methodically without favoritism, with the documentation of who received what and when recorded in the notebook alongside the planting records. The man who had smiled at the reading of the will came to the market stall in November of the 3rd year. He stood in front of it without speaking, looking at the late-season produce that was possible only because of the extended growing season inside the canyon walls and the quantities that were possible only because of a spring that the survey document said did not exist. He looked at the squash and the root vegetables and the dried herb bundles, and his expression moved through several stages before settling on the expression of a man who has been significantly wrong about something and is calculating how to proceed with that information. He asked if the canyon was for sale. I told him it had never been for sale. He asked what I would take for it. I told him nothing, that it was my grandfather's land, left to me because he believed I was the right person to continue what he had started, and I intended to honor that belief for as long as I was capable of doing so. The answer was not hostile. It was complete. There was nothing to negotiate because nothing was being offered. He left without buying anything. I turned to the next customer, who wanted winter squash and was holding exact change, and I weighed it and took the coins and wrote the transaction in the notebook and moved to the next person in the line that had formed while we were talking. 20 years later, the canyon terraces are deeper than when I inherited them because I have been adding organic material every season as my grandfather did. And depth increases slowly and surely, the way anything increases when you do the right thing repeatedly over enough time. The spring has not changed. The basalt walls have not changed. The microclimate has not changed. The frost line still ends at the canyon rim every October, and the growing season still runs 6 weeks longer than the open valley, and the 3 gravity-fed basins still distribute the spring water to the 4 terraces without a pump or a mechanism that can fail. What has changed is Harlan County's understanding of the canyon, from the parenthetical notation of no water, no access, no value, to the most consistently productive agricultural land in the county, documented in the land office records and known to every family that has purchased from it in the 20 years between the drought of the 3rd year and today. The cousins who smiled at the reading of the will are still in Harlan. We are civil. They have bought from the canyon in years when the valley harvest was short. We have not discussed the smile, and we will not. There is no advantage in discussing it, and there is no need. The canyon has said everything that needed to be said, slowly and over time, in the specific language of soil and water and yield that does not require anyone's commentary to be understood. My grandfather spent 30 years building something invisible that became undeniable. I have spent 20 more making it larger. The 5th terrace I have been preparing for 3 seasons is not yet at the soil depth his planting records indicate as optimal. I add to it every autumn with the composted material I carry in the same canvas sack he used, worn now at both straps from years of use, the canvas stiffened with the mineral residue of hundreds of loads of amendment. The 2nd spring channel I have been tracing through the north wall will take another year of patient observation before I am certain of its path. The water is there. I can feel it when I press my palm against the basalt at the right point and hold it for 30 seconds, exactly the way he held my hand against that wall when I was 9 years old and showed me the first thing he had found in this canyon that nobody else knew was there. There is always more to build. There is always more to understand. That is not a problem, that is the nature of the work, and the work continues whether or not anyone is watching, because the canyon does not require an audience to produce what it produces. It only requires someone willing to descend and to stay, and to pay the kind of attention that takes 30 years to reward, and rewards completely when it finally does. The canyon never needed anyone to believe in it. It only needed someone willing to go down.